Hi, my name's Phil. I like to talk about politics, and in this video I'd like to discuss a report from the Food Standards Agency which highlights the fact that our food testing regime for imports and exports is creating extra barriers to trade. This is leading to longer delays in the transporting of food, along with the shorter shelf life that you inevitably get from that, and also setting us up for, if we had a emergency situation in our food supplies, for example like the BSE crisis, this would make it way worse. I mean, one of the issues highlighted is if you've got lorry loads of food being exported from the EU to Britain, it's having to be diverted back into the EU for checks because we don't have the facilities around the border or inside Britain itself. The Telegraph, of course, report this as EU red tape jeopardising food safety. Warn retailers, they said. They say retailers are warning the EU red tape is jeopardising food safety. Being clear, no, they're not. You will not find a single retail group saying this. And this is an even madder take than usual from a pro-Brexit outlet. Like, I subscribe to a few industry journals, and where they use a term at all, it's described as Brexit red tape. The grocer, for example, representing food retailers, surprisingly enough, refers to Brexit border checks when talking about this, because that's what they are. Didn't exist before Brexit. It's not the EU. The EU's existed for a long time. But these have only existed since Brexit, because that's what's caused them. Usually when they talk about EU red tape knackering some aspects of trade, they mean the World Trade Organization rules that they thought were all brilliant before we left the EU. It's not EU red tape. It's normal international trading red tape that if you want it reduced or removed, you work on trade agreements to align standards. That's what normal countries do. What we did is we worked on a trade agreement to cause divergence at the behest of the likes of the Telegraph, and so we created extra red tape. However, in this context, blaming it on EU red tape is even madder because it's got absolutely nothing to do with the EU. This is imports into Britain we're talking about. The EU don't decide anything about that. The only imports the EU care about within the UK, as I discussed yesterday, are those going into Northern Ireland. After we left the single market, we spent years applying no standards controls at all. We've only just begun this year. The EU didn't say a word about it, not a word of complaint, because actually that gave their businesses an unfair competitive advantage over our own, as well as from other countries, but that's our problem, not theirs. So it's not EU red tape, it's maybe you could say WTO red tape, but if you're going to name the bureaucracy after the market imposing it, it's British red tape. But dodgy reporting aside, the real issue here, we don't have the capacity to carry out food standards checks ourselves. Now, in the Guardian report on this, it did quote the government as saying, well, it's normal for laboratories to subcontract to other laboratories where specialist testing is needed. And that's absolutely true. But it also highlights the madness of leaving the single market, because it is absolutely true that for some specialist testing, you're not going to need a lot of provision even across a continental market. Like, there's so little of that specialist testing needed, you wouldn't even have a laboratory in every single country. So there's not enough to justify jamming it all into one country because there's not enough work for them to be commercially viable. But therein lies the madness of Brexit, because it was predicated on this idea that we shouldn't pool resources with our continent, we should do everything ourselves, sovereignty. But the only way we could do that is to build up facilities which would need excessive resourcing for the work they do. For example, the aviation authority we had to set up cost 10 times as much as our contribution to the European equivalent, and it doesn't do anything extra. And the private sector's not going to do this itself. It's not going to go, well, we'll just spend loads of money and get no return. It's not commercially viable. And the Conservative Brexiteers were never going to do it because they don't like the state spending money on things. And this would be a lot of money. So what we've ended up with is having to continue to use the European network of testing labs, and in actual fact use them even more because of the trade barriers we've raised. And because of the delays in doing this, food is spoiling, which means it can't be sold, which means at some point you just have to stop importing food from that supplier because it can't get to you. And other food has significantly shorter shelf life, which those of us who manage food shopping have, of course, noticed. So this notion of being able to do everything ourselves is complete rubbish. Neither the government nor private sector wants to run inefficient facilities. So the core concept of Brexit falls completely on its arse. But although the government were right to say it is normal to subcontract out specialist testing, there was something they were reported as saying it's not quite true. So according to the article, they also said they were confident that we had the testing laboratory capacity. But according to the report from the Food Standards Agency's chief scientific advisor, this is not entirely right. Even when you take away some of those labs that have the specialist labs that have always existed in places like Germany, in fact, they highlight three major concerns on this point. The first, the big one, is since Brexit, because some critical testing was only ever available in other countries, and we haven't built it up here, and we're not going to, because like I said, it's not viable. We would be vulnerable if we had a major incident. Now, the report doesn't go into details on that, so let me elaborate on what we're talking about here. So let's go back to the BSE crisis. Let's say we had a BSE level issue with some aspect of our domestic food production. The EU would, of course, ban that food from export to their market. So in this case, it would be like British beef. I mean, that's what actually happened during the BSE crisis. And we were EU members then, but they still protect the market. So British beef wasn't going anywhere. So, of course, it would happen with us as a third country. Immediately, all blocks on those exports. Now, that, of course, would knacker our export trade. That's bad enough. That's the BSE level crisis. And it will take a long time to persuade people that actually now we've got some of the safest beef. But what about domestic production? So let's say we can go, okay, but we can still sell it in our own market, and it'll have to go through extra checks to make sure that it's safe. But there will be producers who are producing safe stuff, and that's fine, and we can sell it in our own domestic market. How do we prove it's safe for our own market? We can't, because if the laboratory that can do the check is in Germany, and we can't get it to Germany, even just for testing, because there will be a complete block, not just for sale in the EU, but from export to the EU, then we're screwed. Which means if we do get a major incident, and the only way to prove that related food is safe is with a testing laboratory in the EU, and we can't get it there, then even food which is safe can't be proven safe for our own market, which means you do way more damage to our food production sector than necessary. The second concern is more ongoing. It's less serious, but it is an ongoing one because that's to do with an emergency. We might not get an emergency for 5 or 10 years or so. Second concern is that some of the specialist facilities we have are not commercially viable now. They were before Brexit and they're not now, so they've been diminishing. So the report says that our testing capacity has actually been going backwards since Brexit. And that makes sense in line with what I said earlier. Because there are trade barriers between Britain and the EU, it's now more time consuming and expensive to get anything from the EU to Britain. So, for example, from the EU to a British laboratory for testing, I mean, if it's going to be sold in the EU, work for these labs from the EU is obviously going to be scaled back. So what specialist capacity we did and do have in Britain is being diminished. And the third problem is the supply of workers. The report says there aren't as many people entering the profession. It highlights toxicologists in particular. The report did note, however, the only good news in it, that now we're back in Horizon. We've now got better scientific data sharing. So actually we can keep more up to date and it's easier to hire than it was before. In other words, the only silver lining is an example of closer cooperation with the EU. What does that tell us about what we should be doing? But still, a lack of domestic workers entering the profession will make it harder for labs to operate in the future without being able to recruit from overseas, which Brexit has made way more difficult. Mind you, the third one does at least have a solution if the government is proactive. Sell the career to young people, offer financial inducements to study and get on that career path. Whether they do that is up to them, but, of the problems raised here, that is the one that's by far the easiest to deal with. But the main points I would make here are that this shows we can't go it alone. Supply chains are just more efficient when they cover a larger area because there will always be need for a product or a service that you don't need loads of. They're important, they're vital, like parts for lifts, for example, I've talked about before, but you only need so many of them. So you only really need one or two facilities or one or two factories, even across an entire continent. And if you can have that and you can have free movement across that continent for supplying, that's more efficient. It allows a business to run more efficiently, more competitively on the global market. A continental supply chain is always more efficient than one that's isolated within an island off the continental coast. And because of the barriers to trade and movement that we have implemented, we have reduced the viability of testing facilities in Britain for EU customers, which means there's now more pressure for these specialist facilities to be set up in the EU where there are more customers for them, taking jobs and income away from Britain, as well as leaving our own businesses stuck because they're going to have to, if those facilities pop up in, say, Belgium or France or somewhere, they're going to have to use them if they no longer exist in Britain. So they're going to have to go over that trade border to access the same services, even if they're just selling to the British market. Yeah, you're just shifting money from Britain to the EU. That's what Brexit does. And this sort of trading reality exists in multiple different sectors. This is, after all, a service trade. It's not manufacture, service trade. But because it requires the physical movement of something, unlike our much larger financial and legal services, it's still hit by Brexit. And it doesn't just hit our businesses, it hits consumers as well. Some food can't make it in time, so that means there's some things we used to get into the country we can't anymore. And the Guardian article warns that some EU suppliers are going to reconsider whether it's worth supplying Britain at the end of their contracts. They've got contracts, it's a hassle. Some of them are going to decide it's too much hassle at the end of the contract and not renew it. So it's not even like we're at peak shortages now, because it's still going to get worse. And with the food we can still get, it's more expensive because baked into the cost is the standard certification, the checks that came as a result of Brexit trade barriers. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. If you enjoyed the video, please subscribe for further content and click the like button. You can also sign up for memberships if you'd like to support the channel further. Thanks for watching. Until next time, I'll see you later.